Hello and welcome to everyone who has joined us for this interview, which is part of the Cambridge Judge Business School video series, CJBS Perspectives, Leadership in Unprecedented Times. By way of introduction, my name is Thomas Roulet. I'm an associate professor in organization theory and the deputy director of the MBA program here at the Cambridge Judge Business School. And today we are hugely honored to be joined by Cambridge Judge alumna Amelia Dunlop. Amelia, welcome.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Amelia is the Chief Experience Officer at Deloitte and author of the recently published best-selling book, Elevating the Human Experience, 3 Paths to Love and Worth at Work. I have it here. And I really enjoyed this book for a very precise reason, is the values and the message that you translate into this book is one of the core messages I use in my leadership class here at the Cambridge Judge, is the importance of care and love, and the importance of self-love, but also the importance of loving others and making them feel worthy at work and in groups and in teams and in organizations. And I'm going to start with a very general question. In the book, and I really like that bit, is you talk a little bit about yourself, about your experience, about your path, and it gives a really nice personal touch. And so I'm a little bit curious to hear more, and I think the people who are watching us will be delighted to hear more about your background. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your career so far, and what led you to write this book?
All right, then. So Thomas, thanks for having me. Thank you for inviting me and to the team that's hosting this. So you may not know this based on my accent, but I was actually born in England. And I lived there until I was about 5 years old when my parents moved to Florida, where I was raised until I went to Harvard at the ripe young age of 17. And it was there that I studied sociology and psychology. And I went from Harvard to a master's program in theology, which is not the sort of the usual path that you might expect. But I had done my undergraduate thesis on the religion of Generation X, and I had all these questions, Thomas, all these questions about meaning and purpose. And so my advisor said, "Okay, well, go and actually do the master's in theology degree." So I did that degree, and I thought, I'd go on to do a PhD, like you and others, and that would be my career. But I was a poor graduate student. And I needed a job for the summer in between that 2-year master's program. And I got very lucky to get a summer internship at a strategy firm called the Monitor Group, based in what I refer to as the other Cambridge, so here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that was for me that jumping off point between the world of academia and the world of business. And for those of you who know, management consulting is very much about solving really gnarly problems on behalf of our clients, some of which requires, an ability and a rigor to look at problems differently, which does have a kind of grounding in research and in academia. And I loved that experience. I felt like I had the best of both worlds, and I got to be, one part kind of academic, in graduate school, and one part management consulting in the real world. And I pursued that for a number of years before I felt like I had always wanted to go back to England. And I'd always wanted to get an MBA because I was the theology student, right? I was the theology student in the business world. And I felt like maybe there were some gaps, maybe there were some things that I could go back and learn. And that's what brought me to the Judge for the MBA program. And it was a wonderful experience. My husband and I came over, and that's where I obviously studied for the MBA. And I did my thesis there on the morality of capitalism. So like you can see there's a thread, right? There's a thread of the kind of the sociology and the theology and the kind of the world of business. And, I was fortunate after the MBA to rejoin the Monitor Group in London. And then eventually my husband and I moved our 3 children to Boston, which is where I am right now. We've been here for the past 14 years. And professionally, Deloitte acquired Monitor about 8 or 9 years ago. And so I've been a part of Deloitte since then, and been very fortunate to continue to grow my career here. So that, in a very quick narrative, is the journey.
Well, I think that's very inspiring, and to hear, how, a posteriori, looking back at your career, it all makes sense. It all, fell together, and, it led you to where you are now, to writing this book, to this step of your career. And I always tell the students, to stop stressing about what are the next steps, and to think, more openly about their career and how to move forward. You became a partner at 35. So that's very impressive.
Thank you. Yes, I did become a partner at age 35. I also became a partner the same day my third child was born. So one of the stories that I often get to tell people is my May 27th, 2011 is a very important day in our house, because that's the day my daughter was born in the front seat of the car on the way to the hospital. And when I went to turn on my phone, once we finally arrived at the hospital, to kind of call my parents, tell them that Louisa had arrived, I had all these congratulations messages. And it's like, how is it possible? Nobody knows yet that I've had a baby. But it was because that was the day the announcement went out to the partnership that I was promoted. So yes, it's a special day.
Good things arrive together. This is an incredible story.
Well, and I guess it sort of, for me, highlights that kind of convergence. And I write about this in the book, of personal and professional, right? And that sometimes I'm asked, is this a personal book? Is this a professional book? And I somewhat cheekily just say yes, because it is both. And I feel like what I wanted to do was write a book that was equal parts head and heart, and equal parts personal and professional.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. I think you bring a lot of yourself in the book, and that's what makes a good book, is when it's not only about learnings for everybody else, but also learning for the person who writes it, because it comes into the book. So I really enjoyed that aspect. So actually, this leads perfectly to the next question, which is about your title and your current role as a Chief Experience Officer at Deloitte. Can you tell us a little bit about what it means to be a Chief Experience Officer? Because many people might not know. It's a fairly new emerging role. And so really curious to hear about that.
Yeah, very happy to. So my background and field had always been in strategy and in innovation. And human-centered design is a huge part, as you know, of what it means to do the work of innovation. And so I had been leading our US strategy and innovation practice for the last number of years at Deloitte. And we set an aspiration to elevate the human experience. And I'll tell you, Thomas, at the beginning, we didn't necessarily know what that meant. But we had this idea that it was more than the customer experience, and more than the employee experience, and more than the impact we have with our partners and in our society. And we wanted to do something that had that higher kind of aspiration. And this was almost 4 years ago. And so we started quantifying it. We started doing research into it. And as I was starting to talk more and more about it, it was clear that that I kind of transitioned into the role around Chief Experience Officer. And so I'll say the way that I've seen that role to kind of develop, both my own and others that I've met with in other organizations, it tends to be the person who's really most concerned with how the experience is delivered for your customers, your employees, and your partners. And that can mean a number of things. That can mean your contact centers. That can mean your innovation. That can mean your customer satisfaction. And so it's been a lot of fun, because for me, I've embraced the role largely around how do we just make an experience just a little bit better. And what does it mean to deliver on that for our clients and for the customers our clients serve.
And do you think that this is a role that is going to become more and more common in a lot of organizations? And I guess the second question I have is that, when our students are going to hear about this, they might think, well, that could be a career that I would like to embrace. So what would be the best way to, approach the career in that field and potentially leading to such role?
Yeah, so I'll take that in two parts, right? So I do think the role is it's newer, and I do think we're seeing it more and more established. Sometimes it's called Chief Customer Officer, sometimes Chief Experience Officer. They're kind of interchangeable, so that's one thing to note. And I absolutely do believe that in addition to the role of marketing, right, or the role of innovation, or your Chief Sales Officer, someone who is actually thinking about the entire journey, all the different touch points and all the ways in which we might delight or not our various stakeholders. So I think that is the role. In terms of fellow judge students who might be thinking about how to move into that career, I think the discipline of human-centered design, just the methods around customer experience metrics, those are some of the disciplines I think that help to kind of move in that direction. And I think there's just a healthy curiosity around kind of how do we challenge orthodoxies and how do we not accept the status quo, but think about how we might deliver a better experience.
Thank you. And that's very inspiring. And I think this is a career that I hope many of our students will think about embracing in the future. And
well, I'll tell you, actually, I have a fellow classmate who reached out to me fellow classmate from Judge who reached out to me because he was taking on a chief customer officer role. And so we had the opportunity to exchange stories, talk about his experiences, talk about, how to lead with a lot of the influence that's necessary. So I'm not the only one out there, Thomas, in our class.
That's good, very positive. That's a very hopeful message for the next generations. Maybe we should do a panel of all the chief experience officers that graduated from the Cambridge Judge.
That would be fun. Well, I was thinking as you described your own coursework, I wish I had been able to take your class.
I know, and that leads me to the next question, is that unfortunately, and I apologize for that, I was not yet at the Judge when you came. And so I just was curious to hear, about your time at the Judge, and in particular, how Cambridge and your year in the MBA helped you explore the bigger ideas and questions around finding meaning, purpose, and love at work.
Oh, that's a great question. I would say a number of different things. I feel like having lived in England, moved back to the United States for most of my schooling, and then coming back to Cambridge, I feel like one of the things that I benefited from, like so many do, is just that broadening of perspectives and broadening of experience. So I do think, and that's all contributed, right? So, to the same point we were making earlier, that in retrospect, all the experiences seem to make sense. I do feel like the broadening in meeting so many classmates from all over contributed. I was able to, as I already mentioned, use some of the time to really explore some of the topics that were a passion for me. And that's around that topic of morality and capitalism, which is very much the kind of the meaning and the whole purpose of why we work and what we work to accomplish. So I'd say that would be the other way in which Judge kind of gave me that opportunity.
Absolutely. Okay, let me transition into talking a little bit about your book. So I don't want to spoil it because I'm hoping that many people will be curious to go and get it and read it. But I would like, a few spoilers for our audience. And so I'm going to start with a broad question on the topic of your book. So how would you explain and define what is love and worth at work? And what are the three paths that you describe in your book? And maybe I'm hoping that this might lead us to talk about this concept of worthiness gap that you mentioned in the book.
All right, let's go for it. So the book is called Elevating the Human Experience, 3 Paths to Love and Worth at Work. And I do use the word love deliberately. And you know this, Thomas, that I could have used any other word. I could have talked about care. I could have talked about respect. But I felt like it was important to be just a little bit provocative because I know that putting the words love and work together can make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable at times. And I wanted to challenge the reader, challenge myself around why not love. And so I use the definition that kind of builds upon Erich Fromm from his book, The Art of Loving, back in the 1950s, which is, it's the choice we make to extend ourselves for our own or another's growth. And growth is a really important word. And I think the reason I chose this definition is it's much closer to the Greek word for love, which is eudaimonia, right? So the Greeks have 7 different words for love to our 1 in the English language. And so I felt like this idea of love, which is more about flourishing, absolutely is necessary in the work context. particularly now that we spend more time at work than any other time in history, and in many different cultures. So that's my kind of definition of the word love. And then I kind of went on to explore this idea of worthiness, because as I say in the very opening of my book, ever since I was a little girl, I felt unworthy of love. And I often talk about the fact that something felt off, crooked, like the little pinky finger, which doesn't quite straighten. And it's because no amount of, the gold stars, no amount of the resume that you read back to me actually can make us feel worthy if we don't feel that intrinsically in and of ourselves. So I just wanted to explore this idea of love and this idea of worth in the work context, and how do we grow in both. So to do that, I do tell my own personal stories. I did about 30 ethnographic interviews, but I also grounded it in a quantitative study of 6,000 people based in the US. So we haven't done the global study, but it was based in the US. And I really just wanted to explore, like, was I alone? Am I the only one who has some of these feelings? So I had these hypotheses, Tomas, that it might vary by men and women, it might vary by age, by different racial identities and gender expressions. So I share all that in the book in terms of how things vary. But the most surprising thing for me was what identified where 9 out of 10 people said that it was important to them to feel worthy of love. But about half, and it's like myself included, struggle at times to feel worthy in the context of work. And I call that gap the worthiness gap. And so then what I do in the book is I explore what are the 3 paths that we might go down to help grow our sense of love and worth. And that first path is the one that we walk alone, right? It's at the end of the day, we're in a room by ourselves. What messages are we sending ourselves to help us feel worthy of love? And then the second path is the impact that we can have on another, right? We all can show up as a mentor. I use the word allies and being an ally to another in the workplace. And then the third path is, what does it mean to, for all the people who we may not directly meet, but creating that system in a community of work where we feel like we can bring our authentic selves. And so that's the third path. The third path is the community.
And I mean, I think you are absolutely correct. That's the path to, spreading those values within the organization is to first, spread the value to yourself, or think about yourself think about your own worth before trying to make other people feel their own worth. So I really like the structure of the book around those 3 paths. And the importance of starting with oneself. And so could you tell us a little bit about how you, work with those values at Deloitte, with the people you work with? Is there, any practical advices you could share in considering your large experience as a manager, as managing and working with people? What are the key practices, the key approaches to getting people to feel their worth and to getting people to feel loved at work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think my first answer to that is there is no silver bullet, right? And there are as many ways to help someone feel worthy as there are individuals, right? So I don't think I'd want to suggest that there's a silver bullet. I guess what I hope with this book and with this type of conversation, Tama, is it would raise people's awareness, both of the need, right? So I try to talk about why there's a need, why I believe that we need to go ahead and try and elevate the human experience, and then to give people some of the tools for what they might say to someone else, how they might act, and how they might sort of show up. So just I guess a couple examples. And one of the things I should say by way of parentheses, I have friends and colleagues who'll tell me like, "Hey, Amelia, I read your book and it really challenged me." I say, "Great," because it really challenges me too, because many of the things I talk about in the book, no one could do every day, right? And I'm the first to admit that you don't have to go far or wide to find someone who'd be like, "Hey, Amelia actually didn't elevate my experience with that last call or that last meeting." And so I think it does set a bit of a challenge to all of us that we, as humans, we're not going to live up to every day. But I'd say some of the things that I try to be conscious of is particularly in this world, right, where we're kind of just like 2 by 2 inch square, and it's kind of hard to feel seen, is really acknowledging people. It's simple things like calling them by name, by inviting their thoughts and perspectives. Gratitude, all the research shows is one of the best ways to to help to make someone feel like they were seen and their contributions were valued. And it's the simplest thing, right? So I find often at the end of a very long day, as I go back over the day, I'll think about who is it that I want to text, who is it that I want to send an email to, just to say thank you, and to be as specific as possible, right? And as opposed to kind of general. So I think gratitude is important. I think I've thought about the fact that in the world of business, words of kindness are still differentiating. I don't think they should be, but they are. So I do think, seeing someone kind of offering a word of kindness is important. And then there's very practical things. Something that I call the 10% rule, which I often talk about the fact that in this kind of crazy busy, we're all feeling burnt out. I remember having a mentor who shared with me that often when we feel like we're doing too much, right? And it may be for, any personal individual reason, but for me, it was the time when I'd come back to work after my second maternity leave. And this mentor sort of counseled me and said, often when we think we're doing too much, we got to go chuck it all, right? We're going to go become a goat herder because, these professions that we've chosen are too much. And his counsel was, before you make a 180-degree change, make a 10-degree change. And that's why I've always thought about that as the 10% rule, because Thomas, 10% can be 6 minutes of every hour, right? It can be, a couple hours of every day. It can be almost a day of a week. And when we reframe it that way and think about actually, we do have the choice to give ourselves back that time and or give that time to another. It helps to kind of reduce some of the enormity of the pressures that we might feel.
And there's a message you touched upon, which also resonated with me, is the idea of authenticity. So I also talk a lot about this in my leadership class and have a lot of discussion with the MBA students around authenticity. And it's become a huge concept, both from a managerial perspective and in academic research. So, and you touched upon that in your book, and you have just mentioned it. So what can be done to encourage people from all backgrounds, including historically marginalized groups, to bring their authentic selves into the workplace?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I recall I was leading this practice, and I was welcoming a group of our new hires, and I remember in particular one young woman said something to me afterwards and just thanked me for being refreshingly authentic. And it stuck with me because I just thought, and I said to her, I love, thank you, of course, but it's far easier for me to be exactly who I am than it is for me to figure out which version of myself you would like me to be. That takes way more mental energy, way more sort of psychic income. And it definitely took me a longer time to figure that out. So I say that I feel like I wrote this book for a younger version of myself. So I hope that people do figure that out sooner than I did. But there is something really special about being authentic, and people know how to find you because they know exactly what they're going to get with who you are. And I've really appreciated that. There's a reason that you found me. There's a reason that others have found me, that when we are authentic, people know how to find us. And then to your point, let's talk about the systems that make people feel like they can't show up with who they are, that they have to hide some version of themselves, some part of their identity. And that, I think, is the struggle, right? And I talk about the fact that I don't think it's our responsibility to lean into these systems that marginalize individuals, but to redesign them and deconstruct them to help make it possible that everyone could feel like they could show up with their authentic self.
And you mentioned this 10% idea also, which I found really interesting. And we are in an era where people are actually very often thinking about this 180-degree change. So we have heard a lot about people leaving their job because of lack of meaning. So this idea of the Great Resignation, which is, challenged, but probably points out at a phenomenon that does exist, or a Graeber's perspective on bullshit jobs. So how do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the need to consider and to elevate the human experience in organizations? And how have the needs of employees changed since the pandemic?
Yeah, no, well, I would say that no organization has been immune from the Great Reevaluation, the Great Resignation. And I've definitely felt that too. I actually wrote an article on the fact that at some point it felt like every time I received a text or an email, it was because a friend or colleague was telling me that they were leaving. and it does so much because you're sad that this person's leaving. You then ask yourself, like, well, why am I not leaving? Like, there's all these questions that this Great Reevaluation has put upon all of us. But I guess at some point I realized that there's only so much more money and there's only so much better sounding, cooler sounding title that any of us can get. And that what it comes down to it is, are we in a place that makes us feel worthy? And so I talk about in this article the idea that the strategic organizations are going to be the ones that figure out how to help make their employees feel like who they are is fundamentally respected and loved in the context of their work. And so my hunch, and you've been studying this organizational dynamics more than I have, my hunch is that one of the lasting impacts of the COVID-19, of this whole hybridization of the workplace, will be the emphasis put on not just kind of what work product and output are we contributing, but how is work contributing to our sense of meaning and purpose.
And how can we grow? How can we grow within our organization, and how can the organization help us grow despite a world that might be stuck? And I find this contrast sometimes hard to manage for organizations where they are really very constrained by the pandemic. There's a very high level of uncertainty, but at the same time there is a very high demand from employees to grow, to develop, to evolve, to not feel stuck. And there's really this kind of clash between the organizational constraints and the individual desire. So what can we do, at the organizational level to help this growth?
Well, so one thing that I think a lot about is what we can do as an individual. And there, I think we should talk a little bit about allyship. And so I in the research, I realized that there are 4 kinds of allies. So the first is our friends, right? The friends are the ones that, in the context of work, where they don't care what kind of feedback you got that day, right? Good feedback, bad feedback, they're just there with you. They're probably the ones, texting you or sending you a funny meme right now. And they actually do play a significant role in our ability to kind of feel valued in our context of work. Then we have the mentor who offers that wise word, that kind of coaching that kind of helps us see things just a little bit differently. And I used to think those 2 categories were enough, Thomas, right? That I was a good leader if I was a friend and if I was being a thoughtful mentor. But then I really realized that there's 2 other categories which require great, more focus. And that's the idea of a sponsor and a benefactor. And the sponsor, in the way I understand it, is the person who uses whatever power they have, positional power, personal power, to take action on someone else's behalf, whether or not they know it, right? So the kind of classic example would be advocating for somebody when they're not in the room, right? Throwing their hat in and saying, you know what, I think Thomas is ready for this next level, even before you might think it. And then the benefactor is the person who does all those things that, it's, friend, mentor, sponsor, but typically over a longer period of time, right? They're not just with you in kind of one role, but they might be someone you would know over the span of your career. And I talk about these 4 types of allies because they're very practical things that we can do every day, right? And so what I like to do is, you can imagine this exercise. It's like a little balance sheet where I start to think about, okay, so who am I a friend, a mentor, a sponsor, and a benefactor to? And you can kind of write it down. And then on the flip side, who are playing those roles for me? And who are the people who are reaching out to me? Who are the people who are sponsoring me? And I like thinking about it that way because it then you start to be able to be a little bit more intentional about how we were elevating the experience for the people around us.
Thank you. I mean, I have one last question about the book. I wanted to hear a little bit about the learning curve from your research and writing the book. And also, what you have heard and learned from people who have read the book since it was published. You mentioned a couple of examples of people who came back to you with their learnings and their takeaways from the book. But how is it informing your current management practice? And, what do you think are the next steps, the next big topics that you're gonna work on developing that idea and that stream of work?
Well, I mean, I'll say anytime someone writes to me about how the book has impacted them, I'm very touched, right? Because as you know, just being read is a gift. And then kind of reaching through the unknown to try to connect. I talk so much about how connection is so important. So I do love it when people tell me what it is that's resonated with them, and how whether it's one of my favorite examples, I think I mentioned this to you, was the night before book launch. I didn't realize that the kind of Kindle version was already available, right? So I thought it was coming out to the world October 26th. And I was starting to feel quite nervous because, as you know, the book was very personal. I felt quite a lot of vulnerability in the book, and I hadn't shared it with anyone. But so the night before the book launched, I got an email from a fellow partner who I know, but not super well. And he told me that he picked up downloaded the Kindle version, read it cover to cover over the weekend, and it had already changed how he showed up at work on Monday. And I was blown away, right? Because he didn't have to write to me. He didn't have to be quite so thoughtful. And I felt like, if that's it, if I've touched one person and helped one person see himself differently, see his teams differently, show up differently, then my work here is done. And so that's been a delight. And then to the other part of your question around what comes next, I am currently working on a project with a co-author on the topic of trust, because we realized early on during the pandemic that you can't elevate anyone's experience, whether individually or as an organization, if you're not trusted. So we've done a lot of work to kind of identify what is the predictive measure of trust to help organizations build that kind of long-term loyalty, and how is it tied to results. So that we're working on now and will be out later in the fall. And then I think there may be yet another project out there in the future, Tomas. I feel like there's something about human flourishing that I've been really intrigued by, and what does it mean truly to flourish in the context of work. And I know Adam Grant, organizational sort of psychologist, has a really great article that's been well circulated on the idea of languishing. I like the idea of flipping that and really thinking about what would it really take to feel like we could all flourish in the context of work. And then we would know that we had elevated the human experience.
Yeah, and in your book, you start with this note on suffering, on explaining that understanding the elevation of the human experience is also to start with understanding the suffering of human experience. And so I think that's quite promising. I'm very excited and very much looking forward to your book on trust. And the other point I wanted to come back to is this story about your colleague, the other partner at Deloitte, who had read the book and right away changed their behavior. And I think the importance of role modeling, of having people at the top that might adopt those values, is going to help those values trickle down to the rest of the organization, and actually deeply change the culture towards a more human-centric culture in the organization. So that's impact.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you might have seen this on LinkedIn. I just published an article that I co-authored with a client of mine on humanizing leadership. And we realized that we shared sort of similar values, and that she was leading an organization in telecommunications, and that the more that we demonstrated more human characteristics, the more other people felt like they could show up. And this is back to your comment earlier about how do we create the circumstances in which other people feel like they can show up authentically. And so we could just kind of riff for a little bit on what are the characteristics that we think make for more human leadership styles. We talk about empathy, we talk about courage, we talk about grace. So yeah, I think there are definitely ways in which as leaders in organizations, we do have the responsibility to kind of lead with a more human style.
Talking about the organizational level, one question I had for you was, about Deloitte. How did it change in the time you have worked there? And are there any comparisons or insights that you can share thinking about your role as Chief Experience Officer, focusing on the overall experience and interaction with clients and the human experience for staff? I mean, have you seen changes, at Deloitte, and how is Deloitte epitomizing those values and this idea of elevating the human experience?
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question. So I guess I would start by saying, Deloitte is the world's largest professional services firm, and our brand promise is to be clear, confident, and human. And I've very much picked up on that, right? It's not new. Deloitte was founded by, a gentleman named Deloitte more than 100 years ago, actually, in England. And so this idea that we were human has always been a part of who we are. I like to believe that I'm helping us along with that kind of promise to kind of bring that to life, particularly in an age where technology is so present. I think some of the things that I would like to believe we've seen change in the last couple of years, I think many organizations would also point to, right? Much greater recognition and understanding of different intersecting identities and how we show up at work. One of the studies in the book, but that a team and I helped lead, was a focus on our junior Black professionals. And what does it mean for them to feel like they were seen, valued, and heard? And in doing that in-depth research and preparing it and sharing it with our CEO, that was all part of a broader kind of understanding and reckoning around kind of race in the United States. So I think that kind of study, we've just done a study, particularly on the women's experience, typically at the point of promotion, so senior manager to kind of to partner, and why why many organizations, our own included, we would see potential drop-offs in that population. So trying to take a research-based approach, trying to kind of have an impact. And I think in my own journey, Thomas, I've really learned a lot about the fact that we don't elevate anyone's experience generally, right? That we have so many different lived experiences that we do have to get down to what are those specific lived experiences and take action there.
Thank you. And that leads me to the last question, which is somehow connected to what we just discussed. But, as a final question, I wanted to hear the advice you may have for leaders, for team members, for our students, anyone really who wants to cultivate a deeper feeling of worthiness and appreciation in their work teams, in their organizations, in their social context. What would be your few advices to our people who are watching us today?
All right. I think the first thing I would check in with somebody is you can't give away anything that you don't have. And so I think that's why I do start with the first path. And I am aware, you call to mind any of your favorite archetype of the, aloof, withdrawn, kind of cold leader, right? And I have a lot of empathy, like what's going on in there, right? Like what sort of personal kind of deficit or lack might they have that is kind of showing up as this sort of cold kind of veneer of what they might project as needed in the workplace. So I would encourage people to take stock of themselves because it's really hard to be empathetic with somebody else if you're not already being empathetic with yourself. So I think there is a certain amount of, acknowledging our own kind of need for kind of growth and reflection. Then we can kind of think about how can we start to give that away. And I've tried to talk about just very simple ways in which we can do this. One that I mentioned in the book is I have a colleague who had just been promoted, and she was, saying, I'm up late at night, I'm up working on weekends, I feel like I spent the last 90 days, and I haven't slept. And I just had to be like, you need to know that you are worthy, right? Like, I hope people are telling you this because you earned the job, you're qualified for the job, you're doing a great job. And maybe people aren't telling you this enough, but you are worthy. And it's just like, I remember the first time a friend of mine told me to be kind to myself. Like I was shocked, right? It's like, oh, like, do we send texts like that now? Like, I didn't know that we talk to each other this way. But I think it's similar, Tomas, where it's, we forget to be kind to ourselves. We forget to tell somebody who might be a little bit struggling or feeling like they're working harder than they can kind of keep up with, to remind them that they're worthy. And so I think those are some of the things I might want to leave, anyone watching this with, is just this idea that, we learn and we make ourselves in the context of our work. We spend so much of our lives in the context of our work that I would hope that it's the place that we feel like we could grow and flourish.
Well, I will really take this away with me, this idea first of self-indulgence, recognizing, our own merits and cutting ourselves a bit of slack sometimes, because sometimes we are just our worst enemy in terms of, demanding from ourselves.
Not
And
just
also,
sometimes, right?
yeah.
Like that voice in our head that no matter what it says, we believe just because it sounds familiar. There's a lot of research on the inner critic, and we're much more critical of ourselves than we would ever be of a friend.
Absolutely. And it is helpful to recognize the achievements of others and to let them know, about their worth and their contribution to an organization, to a team. And sometimes we just forget about something as simple as that, but it can have a huge impact on people's mental health and on people's ability to work and stay motivated as well.
I think that's very true. And I tell you these things, and like I said earlier, it's one thing to know this intellectually, right? For you and I to have this conversation and to understand the words. I think it's much harder to actually put them in action. And so that's what I hope people would feel challenged by, is that, how can we apply them in our next meeting, in our next conversation? Because, there isn't an interaction that isn't worth elevating.
Yeah. And to apply this, it's all in there. So I recommend it. And I would be recommending it to the next generations of MBAs in my leadership class. Well, thank you so much, Amelia. I want to really thank you for joining us today. You have shared such a unique perspective, a groundbreaking insight on the importance of love and worth at work, which feels especially relevant during this time when we are still navigating new styles of working. It's been really interesting to connect with you. We really appreciate your time. We can imagine you are quite busy. So thanks for participating to the CJBS Perspectives, Leadership in Unprecedented Times with Cambridge Judge Business School. And I also want to thank all of our alumni and other members of the CJBS community for joining us today. Thank you, Amelia.
Thanks for having me. It was super fun.
It was fun for me too.